All right. Hello and welcome to our lecture where I'm going to give I'm going to call it a general overview because who knows if it's going to be brief. A general overview of America's rise to becoming a world power. Now, this is going to be very, very, very general. I'm really just going to give you a tiny, 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 tiny introduction into a lot of topics. Ultimately, you will choose a topic and you will research that more on your own. However, before we get into all these topics, I want to take a minute and read this quote to you. This is from Heather Cox Richardson. She's a historian who writes letters each day, really kind of summarizing the news of the day. So this was from August of last year, August 2021. And this was written as President Biden was withdrawing troops from Afghanistan. So this is what she said. She said, but the attacks on Biden for the withdrawal from Afghanistan do raise the important question of when it is in America's interest to fight a ground war. Should we limit foreign intervention to questions of the safety of Americans? Should we protect our economic interests? Should we fight to spread democracy? Should we fight to defend human rights? Should we fight to shorten other wars or prevent genocide? These are not easy questions, and reasonable people can and maybe should disagree about the answers. So she's asking these questions here of when the United States should get involved in other countries, right? Should we limit foreign intervention, being involved, intervening in other countries, to all these different things that she lists here? So I want you to take a minute and I'll let you know when you're going to pause and go ahead and answer these questions, really just responding to this quote. You can do a free response if you wish, or you can answer these questions here. What do you think? Should the United States get involved in other countries? If so, when should we and at what level? So she's given some ideas up here: safety of Americans, protecting our economic interests, fight to spread democracy. And then I asked you here, at what level should we send in advisors? So these are people giving advice, kind of providing leadership. Should we provide money or aid? Should we send troops, actually send soldiers? Should we send weapons or other ideas, right? These are just some ideas of at what level should we get involved? And then also, if you don't think the United States should be involved with other countries, why not? Go ahead and pause here to answer these questions. When you're done, unpause and we'll keep going. Okay, so this next kind of era we're going to talk about here now is the era of imperialism. So imperialism, if you remember, the middle of the 1800s, you have European nations really grabbing countries all over the world, setting up colonies for lots of different reasons. Hopefully you remember that from your world history class. But really the United States was wondering whether they really should be getting involved in this, right? We fought a war to have our own government. And so many Americans felt that colonization and building an overseas empire went against the ideals of our nation, right? It went against the Declaration of Independence, that breakup letter that talked to England, right, about how it's the right of the people to have a government that is by the people, for the people. And so Americans were kind of questioning now whether they should even be involved in building these overseas empires. Now, keep in mind, oh golly. Let's see if I can get this back. Sorry about that. Keep in mind that we had this idea of manifest destiny, right? We'd been moving across the continent from east to west already. So while we may not have had overseas empires in the middle of the 1800s, we certainly were using technology and violence and lots of other ways to take land from indigenous peoples, to take land from Mexico and Mexican people. So it wasn't that we were so much just, totally against this. It was more about this like kind of overseas colonization. Okay. So the next topic is looking at the Spanish-American War. Now, the Spanish-American War, we talked about this a little bit when we studied Teddy Roosevelt. This is what ultimately kind of makes that decision for us, right? Very clearly, we become an overseas empire after the Spanish-American War. This was in 1898. This was a war between the United States and Cuba. The war between the United States and Spain that began in Cuba with the explosion of the USS Maine. And the United States went to help Cubans who were fighting against the Spanish for independence. ultimately, we win this war. The United States wins this war against Spain. And I love this political cartoon, right? You see this eagle representing the United States with the stars and stripes shining behind it. And it's this idea that America went from being this continental nation. And I love this too. In 1798, we only had like part of this country, right? Part of this continent. Now, by 1898, 100 years later, not only do we have control over the whole North American continent, the majority of the North American continent, sorry, Canada, but now we've expanded overseas. And now it's this idea of 10,000 miles from tip to tip, right? So from Manila in the Philippines all the way to Puerto Rico, the United States now has control. So as a result of the Spanish-American War, the United States takes control of Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. And really they have to decide what they're going to do. This could kind of the decision of what to do and what the U.S. does with these different countries is definitely something you can study for your project if you wish. The next thing in this era of imperialism is the annexation of Hawaii. So annexation, we kind of take it and say, okay, you're ours now. This was really led by American businessmen. So a bunch of American businessmen led by people like Mr. Dole, right? As in Dole pineapple. Yes. Moved to Hawaii, bought up a bunch of sugar plantations, and then decided they wanted to be a part of the United States and have the protection of the United States. The Hawaiian people were against this. They have a very famous queen, Queen Liliuokalani, who spoke for the people and was ultimately imprisoned because of trying to prevent the United States from taking over. She did end up giving in because she felt like she had no choice. But again, it's this idea of this kind of forced marriage, right? This, you see the American Army behind this figure of Uncle Sam and this Hawaiian woman. This is the president is creating or overseeing this wedding. Okay. It was really against the will of the Hawaiian people that this happened. And ultimately, it was annexed in 1898, same year as the Spanish-American War, and then ultimately became the 50th state in the nation in 1959. So again, another topic that you can look into if that's something that's interesting to you. All right, now moving into the 1900s, I'm going to actually move this down here. First and foremost, we got to talk about World War I. So if you remember, World War I is 1914 to 1918. And the U.S. really had this policy of neutrality. You can see that this kind of paralyzed a lot of people in the American government. It felt like they couldn't do anything because they didn't want to make one side more angry than the other side. This really was the policy for most Americans until the sinking of the Lusitania. So again, the Lusitania was a British passenger ship with Americans on board that was sunk by the Germans. And so it was really seen as kind of German aggression. Then our neutrality, we kind of see this end, and we see sympathy toward the Allies during World War I. And this is because of a couple of things. Number one, we see what's called, Germany begins what's called unrestricted submarine warfare. Or I should say they resume unrestricted submarine warfare. So they continue this. They have these U-boats that nobody else really has this technology, and they are firing on passenger and warships alike beginning in 1915. And then we also have the Zimmermann telegram. The Zimmermann telegram was a telegram that was intercepted by Great Britain that was from Germany to Mexico, right? That was supposedly asking Mexico to come alongside Germany, and that when Germany wins this war, Mexico will get its land back from the United States. So this really was like, okay, the breaking point, right? And so ultimately the United States did go into war, and we joined the World War I in 1917. World War I was really a treacherous war. We talked about this in class a little bit. I love this aerial photo up here of, you can see just the impact of the trenches on the land. This is in France. Okay. So US joins the war ultimately, April 6th, 1917. And we enter the war alongside the Allies. And so again, this is something that you are welcome to look into if you wish. The war ultimately ends not long after the US joins, on November 11th, 1918. So just about a year and a half later, the war ends. This was called Armistice Day. So armistice, like peace, right? End of fighting. Today we celebrate this as Veterans Day. Okay. So now we're going to move, we're just marching through our time period here, right? So 1914 to 1918. Now we're in this time period of the 1930s. And World War II has been going on, and it starts happening in Asia and in Europe. So China invades Japan in 1931. I'm sorry, the other way around. Japan invades China in 1931. And Germany invades Poland in 1939. Okay, the US really remains isolated, or tries to remain isolated, I should say. We have a policy of isolationism, really not getting involved, right? This idea that if we get caught up in European politics, that it's just going to drag us back into another war. On the other hand, President Roosevelt makes this claim that we're going to be a great arsenal of democracy, that we are going to be providing weapons, right? But we're not going to actually get involved. And so that's kind of, I call it isolationism, kind of, right? So we did support Great Britain during this time. So we also weren't neutral, like we saw with World War I. We never declared to be neutral with this war at the beginning, but we did say we weren't going to be involved. All of that changes on December 7th, 1941, when Japan bombs Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. So this happened, I mentioned the date, it's at the bottom there, December 7th, 1941, and we ultimately end up declaring war on Japan. Now, we also, a little while later, declare war on Germany. However, what we call the European theater, that's really the 10th grade history standards. So in terms of what we are going to focus on for this 11th grade US history class, is the war with Japan and what we call the Pacific Theater. And in the Pacific Theater, the United States has this war strategy called island hopping. And you can see in this map here, all of those islands in red are controlled by the Japanese. So they've been expanding their empire all throughout the 1930s. And so what the United States ends up doing is they go to an island, they fight the Japanese, they secure the island, and then they move on to the next island. They fight the Japanese on that island, they secure that island, and then they move on. Again, there's no way, they don't have the technology. The United States doesn't have the technology at this point to be able to actually fly and bomb Japan all the way over here. So this idea of kind of island hopping from group to group or from island to island. The fighting was brutal. And there's lots of different things that you could, if that's something that's interesting to you, that you're able to research in terms of this project. But this does allow the United States to eventually get close enough to Japan. While all this is happening in the Pacific, back here in the United States, there's a project called the Manhattan Project. The Manhattan Project was a secret kind of project, that's the word I'm looking for. It's right in the name, right? Secret project put together by President Roosevelt to research and develop nuclear weapons. Nobody knew about this, not people in the United States and not our allies. And ultimately, we demonstrated the power of this when we bombed Japan. The first atomic bomb was dropped on August 6th, 1945 on the city of Hiroshima. This bomb was called Little Boy, and 140,000 people died from the blast or within the next few months due to radiation poisoning. Even after this bomb, Japan refused to surrender and continued to fight. And so 3 days later, on August 9th, 1945, we dropped a second atomic bomb. Now, this is the first time, again, on August 6th, the first time atomic or nuclear weapons had ever been used. The second bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki. This one was called Fat Man, and it killed 80,000 people from either the blast or within the next few months due to radiation poisoning. It's these two bombs, along with the Soviet Union also declaring war on Japan, that finally ended this war. And so on September 2nd, 1945, World War II is officially over. Now, keep in mind, Germany had surrendered months before. And so that's one of the reasons why Soviet Union was not actually at war with Japan until this time, right? Until the end of the war, because they were fighting the war on Germany. And again, remember, the Soviet Union is a huge country. So most of its forces at that time were located in the West against Germany. And now they were going to bring forces east to fight this war in Japan. And Japan recognized it was just too much for them. So Japan surrendered, ending World War II, the famous iconic photograph of what we call VJ Day, or Victory in Japan Day, which, as I mentioned, was September 2nd. After the war ended, was the creation of what we call the United Nations. And so I put the crest here as to remind you of that. This was created in 1945 and is still around today. It's really a collection of nations dedicated to solving conflicts through diplomacy. It's a worldwide peacekeeping organization. They tried to do this after World War I, but it didn't really take, and the United States didn't join. And so now we see a much more successful creation of this idea of a world peacekeeping organization that's still very much around today. Okay, here, I told you we're marching through a whole lot of events, just a tiny little snippet of information for y'all, so that you can really think about what you want to study. All right, so the Cold War. This is that time period after World War II, and this is where we see that tension between the United States and the Soviet Union. Okay, there were no actual wars or no actual hot wars between these two nations. They were fought between other nations. They manifested themselves in what we call proxy wars and other conflicts. Europe was really split into two after World War II. You had the East, that was associated with the Soviet Union, that was associated with communism, and you had the West that was under the influence of Western nations, the United States, Great Britain, France, and was associated with democracy. There really was a lot of secrecy and a lot of, you can see this political cartoon here, right? This idea, we call this the Iron Curtain. The Iron Curtain that divided West Europe from Eastern Europe. And there really was just kind of no knowing what was happening in Eastern Europe at the time. The United States really had this policy they called containment. Okay. So containment was this idea of, you know what, the communism exists where it exists. And so, but our goal is going to be to contain it, to keep it there, to not allow it to spread, right? So the Soviet Union, you can see, I love these two political cartoons, right? The bear on the right, Soviet Union wanting to spread communism. And then you have the United States represented by Uncle Sam on the left, trying to rein it in, trying to contain it. And this really carried out in a lot of ways. So one of the first ways was what we call the Truman Doctrine. And this was when President Truman ultimately declared that he would send financial or monetary, right, money. He would send aid to countries to help them establish their democracy, especially if they were fighting communist forces. The two countries the reason why he did this was Greece and Turkey. Both their governments were fighting communist forces. And so the United States, Britain had kind of pulled out. And so the US, President Truman said, we will send money to these nations to establish democracy. So again, not the goal being not allowing communism to spread to any more countries. Another event that happened was the Berlin Airlift. Now, you can see in this map on the right-hand side here, so not only was Europe divided into two, right, the West and the East, but the country of Germany was also divided. So you see here the Western Germany was kind of under, remember, Germany responsible for World War II, all the terrible things, right? So Germany was under the influence of these different nations. So you see the British zone up here, the French zone over here in the West, and then the American zone here. And then you've got the dividing line, and the Soviet Union was under control, or had control over the eastern part of Germany. Now remember, all of these countries were allies during the war. This is one of the things that I should have mentioned with the atomic bombs, but one of the reasons why we see the Cold War was because there was so much anger really from the Soviet Union that they didn't know that the US had nuclear powers, right? That nuclear weapons. The US didn't tell their own allies about these bombs. And so the Soviet Union was like, wait a minute. There was not a lot of trust between the leaders or between the nations. So then when the war was over and we're no longer allies, now we see we're pretty much enemies. Okay. So Berlin is the capital of Germany, and Berlin is located right here in the heart of Eastern Germany. Berlin was also divided. So Western Berlin is still surrounded by Eastern Germany, right? So if you imagine dividing this black dot in half, the left side of this dot was democratic and was allied with Western Germany. The right side of this dot was allied with Eastern Germany, but Western Berlin is surrounded. And so what happened was the Soviets blockaded Western Berlin, and they tried to starve out the people. So the United States, along with Great Britain and France, decided that they were going to airlift. They were going to fly in supplies. Now they couldn't land, but they literally dropped supplies every day for a year so that the people of West Berlin were able to not die of starvation. We're able to have medication and all of that. So again, we see this kind of coming together of the Western nations to support democracy and to try to prevent the spread of communism. Okay. Also, part of this containment policy was the Korean War. The Korean War was fought from 1950 to 1953. This map you can see, now there were definitely some, the North Korean army advanced all the way down here, okay, to this purple line. But then South Korea, with the help of the United Nations and the United States, were able to push those forces back up. So that ultimately, by 1953, this blue line that you see here is the 38th parallel, and Korea remains to this day divided along that line. So North Korea was allied with communism and Soviet Union and China. South Korea was allied with the United Nations, the United States, and democracy. And so by the end of this war, the 38th parallel is designated as the division line, and South Korea becomes a democratic country. North Korea becomes a communist nation. All right. And then after that, we have this event called, I'm trying to get you to see these pictures here, the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis is 1962. This is the closest the United States has ever been to all-out, or the world, I guess you could say, has been to all-out nuclear war. Now, obviously, the United States dropped 2 nuclear bombs. We're the only ones to have ever done that. However, by 1962, in this map in the bottom right-hand corner, you can see Soviet Union, there was a spy plane that noticed the Soviet Union had set up nuclear missiles pointed at the United States. So for 13 days in 1962, I believe October of 1962, the United States was on the brink of nuclear war with the Soviet Union. The U.S. set up a naval blockade, so they used ships all around Cuba to prevent any more nuclear weapons from coming in, and also to prevent other supplies from the Soviet Union coming into Cuba. And ultimately, there were talks between President Kennedy, you can see here, and the leader of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev, who you can also see here, right, in this political cartoon. And they ultimately agreed, the Soviet Union agreed to remove the missiles, and the United States agreed not to invade Cuba. Also secretly, this didn't come out for another about 20 years, so till the 1980s. The U.S. secretly agreed to remove missiles from Turkey, which was close to the Soviet Union. So again, super brief introduction. There's so much more you could study about all this stuff, but these are the topics that you can look into more. Okay. We can't talk about containment and the Cold War without also talking about the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War was from 1965 to 1975. This was an incredibly controversial war for a lot of different reasons. For one reason, this was the first televised war. And so Americans on the news every night are seeing death, and they're seeing war, and they're seeing the awful, awful realities of war. Citizens were told that we were winning this war, but then they would see the death, they would see the destruction, they would see North Vietnam and their forces attacking tons and tons of bases all in one day, and it was a very confusing thing to be told you're winning this war, but then see what you're seeing on television. In addition, there was a lot of confusion about what the war was even about. In fact, Vietnamese, they were fighting for independence. They had fought against France after World War II, because they didn't want to be a colony of France anymore. This was the colony that was formerly French Indochina. And now all of a sudden, there's these American people here. The Americans, on the other hand, are there to stop the spread of communism. So North Vietnam, with the president Ho Chi Minh, was allied with the Soviet Union and with communism. And then South Vietnam had a dictator that was put in place by the United States, not a nice man, but was democracy at the time. I say it in air quotes because it wasn't very democratic yet. So American troops were there to stop democracy. Vietnamese were like, we just want to be independent, leave us alone. And so it was just very confusing. In addition, the United States was fighting fighting against a couple of forces. They were fighting against the North Vietnamese army. They were also fighting against what we call the Viet Cong. The Viet Cong were guerrilla fighters, so they weren't a trained army. You're not going to find them in military uniforms, right? They're people who live in South Vietnam who are fighting for independence. And it was very confusing for a lot of these American soldiers because you don't know who the Viet Cong are. You come up to a village, and for all you know, the people who were sitting there with their farm tools working the land could have been the people who were just firing at you as you were walking up there. Because what the Viet Cong would do is they would fire, they would leave the weapons, and they would run back to their villages and pick up their farm tools and go about their business, right? You never knew who the Viet Cong really were. And so Americans are seeing back at home are seeing American soldiers torture what look like innocent men and women, but we don't know that it's Viet Cong, but then the soldiers may not know it's Viet Cong. It's just very confusing. And these poor American boys are dropped in the middle of the jungle. And then you're using this defoliant that you see sprayed in the upper right-hand corner to strip the leaves off of everything so you can actually, see through the jungle. And that's causing all sorts of problems. Plus, they're using napalm, a jellied gasoline that's exploding everywhere. I mean, this war was crazy. Back at home, you're having all the anti-war protests because people are sick and tired of what's going on. Plus, added to this controversy, Congress never officially declared war. And they're the only branch of the government that can officially declare war. It's very confusing, you guys. So, lots to study if you're interested in the Vietnam War, but really it falls under this idea of containment and not allowing communism to spread. Okay. Ultimately, the United States leaves in 1975, and Ho Chi Minh and the North Vietnamese Army are able to march into Saigon in 1975 and ultimately capture the entire nation of Vietnam, and it becomes a communist state. So really the US kind of loses that one. A couple other things I want to mention that were effects of the Cold War, the Red Scare, right? You all talked about McCarthyism, I know already, but this is definitely something that you're welcome to look into more as a result of this. You also have all the espionage of the Cold War and the spying because of so much fear of communism and the propaganda that the United States was using to keep people scared. In addition, you have the military alliances that were established. You have NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, that's still around today. And you have the Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact was the Soviet Union and Soviet Union allies, and really, again, kind of Eastern Europe and democracy versus the West Eastern Europe and communism versus the West and democracy. So these are other things that you could look into, kind of these military alliances that happen. As a result of these military alliances and all this fear, we have the arms race. We have this race to develop the best weapons. And there's always in the kind of the background, the reality that both the United States and the Soviet Union have nuclear weapons now, right? So again, the US dropped 2 nuclear bombs on Japan, and the USSR was mad. The Soviet Union, the USSR, right? They're the one and the same. They're mad. They were our ally, and they didn't know that we had that technology. So then it became this race. As one country developed a new technology, the next country would. And again, this feeds into the espionage as well. The USSR tested their first nuclear bomb, successfully tested their first nuclear weapon and bomb in 1949. And then the US by 1952 had an even more powerful bomb, the hydrogen bomb, that was tested. In 1953, the USSR tested a hydrogen bomb. So again, you just see this escalation of weapons. And then there's the reality that if we ever use them, we're going to just destroy the world. So we have all these weapons, but we're still fighting with bows and arrows, right? All right. The other effect of the Cold War was the space race. So the space race is just what it sounds, right? A race to space between the United States and the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union sent a satellite into space first. It was called Sputnik. That's in the bottom left-hand corner. They were the first ones to successfully launch a satellite that could orbit Earth and take pictures and do all these things in the United States. As you can imagine, they're spying on us. This is terrible. The United States did not have a whole lot of success, especially early on, but it is due to the space race that NASA was founded. And then ultimately, we reached the moon first. So in 1969, the United States landed on the moon as a result of this race with the Soviet Union. Okay, we're getting close, y'all, I promise. So a couple of things, other events you could consider looking into as kind of the U.S. becomes this world power, right? So all throughout, really in the Cold War, the U.S. is involved in Latin America. And the U.S. uses economic sanctions, primarily economic means, for controlling Latin American countries. I love this map on the right-hand side. So this is during the Cold War. You can see coups with U.S. involvement. So that means like overthrow of a government. That's what a coup is, okay? You can see all of those countries in green are coups that the United States supported, okay? Oftentimes, the United States was supporting a coup against a leader that was democratically elected, that was elected by the people. However, the United States was so freaked out about communism that if any of those leaders had any sort of connections with socialism or more liberal ideologies, right, communism, socialism, the United States would, through the CIA, establish these coups. So countries like Guatemala, countries like, you can see here, Argentina and Brazil, all sorts of different countries that the United States really established a coup or attempted to establish a coup. Nicaragua is also a really famous one. They have this other event called the Iran-Contra affair, where the United States was supporting the Contras, which were fighting against the communist forces of the Sandistas. And then there were weapons being sold to Iran, which was illegal at the time. But the president really wanted to do this. And then it turns out the money that they were getting was being sent to the Contras. It was illegal to do that. Y'all, it's a whole thing. So lots of things you could look into if you're interested, just in U.S. involvement in Latin America during the Cold War. Okay, getting more contemporary here. Operation Desert Storm. So Operation Desert Storm took place in the 1990s. This is 1990 to 1991. Saddam Hussein, who was the leader of Iraq, invaded Kuwait. And the United States didn't like this. So there's a lot of oil in Kuwait, plus Iraq. Saddam Hussein was, a bad guy. So the United States, backed by the United Nations, so they had the support of the United Nations and other nations, gave a deadline when Iraq had to get out of Kuwait. The deadline came and went, and so ultimately they invaded. United Nations, right, or the United States and its allies ended up invading. They attacked and liberated Kuwait, but Saddam Hussein remained the leader of Iraq. However, Iraq was out of Kuwait, and Kuwait was independent again. So that's Operation Desert Storm. Don't forget that, because now we're gonna go to Afghanistan, and we'll be back in Iraq soon. So Afghanistan, we fight a war in Afghanistan from 2001 to 2021. Okay, so a 20-year war. It was all started after 9/11. So 9/11, September 11th, 2001, when the Twin Towers were attacked. Ultimately, President George Bush declares war on terrorism, and so U.S. As a result of declaring war on terrorism, U.S. goes after Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden, who were in Afghanistan. Okay, U.S. troops, though, remained there because of fighting against the Taliban after Al-Qaeda, after Osama bin Laden was ultimately killed. And they remained until the summer of 2021, just last summer. Now, it had ultimately been President Trump who declared we were going to be out of Afghanistan by 2021. So again, President Biden was often criticized last summer for removing troops when Afghanistan wasn't ready, especially because in August of 2021, the Taliban forces ended up taking over. That's this bottom picture here, taking over the last kind of holdout of the Afghan government, which is in the city of Kabul. And so now Afghanistan is under the control of the Taliban. And so, again, it's kind of like, what were we fighting for? But this war was officially declared after 9/11 by President Bush as a war on terrorism and fighting Al-Qaeda, fighting against the Taliban. And then here we are today with the Taliban now in control of Afghanistan. Lots you could look into there, kind of in this theme of America as a world power. And then finally, the war in Iraq. So now remember, Saddam Hussein, still the leader after George Bush Sr., went to war in Operation Desert Storm. Fast forward, 9/11, we go to war in Afghanistan. Now we also are going to go to war in Iraq. This is in 2003. President Bush Jr., the son, declares that there's weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. So large weapons, WMDs, or weapons of mass destruction, and we need to help. So we declare war in 2003. We do end up capturing Saddam Hussein and removing him from power. No weapons, by the way, were ever found. So there's a lot of criticism that this was just President Bush using that to get kind of support to go into the war, because really it was about getting rid of Saddam Hussein. That's some criticism about it. However, there were parliamentary elections eventually held in Iraq, and we did end up getting rid of Saddam Hussein. So there's lots, again, this is just like a super, 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 super tiny overview of a ton of events. You have all of these links and all of this in your note-taking guide. I just want to make sure that you can all see it. Tiny, 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 tiny overview of a ton of things that you are going to decide which one you want to look into more for your project for the rest of this quarter. So hope you got kind of a quick overview of these events. The ones that sound interesting to you, keep those in your brain, and you'll have some time at the end of the week to decide which one you're going to actually focus on. Make sure you finish those structure notes with questions and a summary, and email me if you have any questions. Thanks so much. Have a good day.